Guys, so today I wanted to talk about color tests and the reasons you should do them. When I first started cold porcelain, I did not have any color tests whatsoever. The rule was you just add a little bit of oil paint or you add a little acrylic paint to get the colors you want. That doesn't leave anyone very much information, so I decided I was going to use basically every pigment I had available, whether it was acrylic or oils, and do a test run and see what I came up with. And I was pretty surprised. So as you can kind of see, I'm going to tilt the camera. I have quite a few samples here, and this is just part of them. The way I did my color test was I just mixed a range of color. So this one in particular is Hooker's Green oil paint. And you can see I have the worst lighting because I'm in my basement. It starts from dark to light. So this is more paint and a little bit less and a little bit less. I was not so interested in getting the exact value as in light to dark, but getting the correct hue from that paint to find out. I wanted to find out what hue the paint was, not what value it was. So for instance, if I want a lighter shade of this green, I just add less paint to the clay. So that's pretty basic. So here I have my greens. Now, some of these are oil, some of them are acrylic. Okay, so reasons you would do color test. One, obviously, you know what colors you have available to you. It saves a lot of time. If you want to make a green leaf, well, which green paint should I use? Should I use the acrylic? Which acrylic should I use? Should I use the Hooker's Green? Should I use Christmas Green? Should I use, what was this one? Powdered food coloring. It saves you a lot of time. You don't have to mix up the colors again to find out what green you would get. So for instance, this one is the Hooker's Green, which I think I showed you. And this one's green oxide, oil paint. This one's food coloring. And they're all very different. So, a green leaf is not just a green leaf. You have different shades within it. And so I can go back and I can say, oh, well, it's kind of between these two colors. Well, maybe I'll mix these two pigments together to get the proper leaf color then. The other nice thing about the color test is, let's say I want to coordinate a flower bouquet and I want it in shades of blue and pink and purple. Well, I have my purple shades, so I can look and see, well, I like this purple with maybe this blue. So you can get very specific about, your colors then. So it saves you time that way. What else here? I have a little list of things I wanted to talk about. Saves time and guesswork. Useful to refer back to. You can color coordinate your project. It also shows the range of color, like I said. Oh, one important thing here. Always, always, always record what it is on the back of your chip or your card that you glued them to. And your chips don't have to look like mine, obviously. They could be rounded domes, they could be gummy bear shapes, they could be anything. I just happen to like these flat discs and showing a range of the color based on how much paint I added to the clay. So you want to write what the color was, preferably write the brand, because even within brands, your color can vary. So a Hooker's Green from Winton might be different than a Hooker's Green from Jack Black. Okay. So anyway, you can do color tests for oils, for the acrylics, and you also want, oh, the other thing, sorry, The other thing you want to write down on the back, which I did not do on this one, is the type of clay that you used, because your paints can react differently. Even though it's the same paint, it can react differently in different clays. So if you use Modena, write down Modena. If you happen to use Nara clay, write down that it's Nara. Okay, so now I want to talk a little more in depth about each type of pigment that I've tried out, as far as, you know, acrylic, oils, food coloring, what I like to use, how they react differently, etc. So we'll start with the acrylics. I am cheap. I buy, well, I'm not always cheap, but in this case I'm cheap. Just Walmart brand acrylic, usually Apple Barrel brand. This is terrible lighting. And for a lot of colors it works. Acrylic is usually less pigmented than oils. It's a cheap, easy way to go for coloring an entire mass of clay. I don't recommend it necessarily for painting on top of clay after it's dried, but I do recommend it for most light to medium coloring of your clay mass. The more acrylic paint you add, or actually any paint you add to clay, the faster it's going to dry. And I think I've noticed that acrylic paint will usually leave your clay a little more stiff than an oil paint will after it's dry. So those are things to keep in mind. The only time I might possibly use acrylic for painting after dry is maybe if I had an airbrush. That might be handy, because you could get nice soft shades. But as far as like trying to brush on acrylic paint, you can't get, at least as far as trying to paint a flower, you're not going to get those subtle, shifts in color. You'll get brush marks and things like that, and it doesn't look professional. So I would just recommend the acrylics for mixing directly into your entire wet mass of clay to get colors. Okay, so next up we have oil paints. And of course there's a million different brands. My bag out, maybe. So you have Winton. I use Winton a lot. It's reasonably priced. This one's dollar Rowney. I don't know. My husband's an oil painter, so I steal his often. And I prefer to mix. I prefer to use oils because, like I said, they're more flexible, and the color tends to be more concentrated. Usually, you get what you pay for with oil paints. The more expensive they are, the more concentrated they are, and I assume it's probably that way with the acrylics as well. So. Oil paints can also be used after the clay is dry, and you can mix it with an oil medium. And there's various mediums out there. I'll discuss that in another video, but some of the mediums will make the clay shiny. Now I'm still talking about after it's dry. If you paint it after it's dry with certain mediums, it'll be super shiny. Some mediums will make it more matte. One thing I will say about, I'm sorry about the shaky camera. One thing I will say about oils is you need to make sure that you're using hues when it comes to cadmium paint. Cadmium is basically lead. If it says cadmium hue, it's meant to look like cadmium paint, but it's not true cadmium paint. So there's no cadmium in it, and you're not, like, you know, poisoning yourself. So, for instance, if I can find one. This is cadmium yellow deep hue. Now, if it just said cadmium yellow, it would have lead in it, but any of the hues don't. The hue would also be more translucent than just a straight cadmium, and I would never use pure cadmium in any of my work because I don't want to be handling, like, at least when you're painting, you're not like sticking your fingers in the paint, but when you're obviously working with clay, your fingers are in it all the time, so it's not healthy. But I do recommend using cadmium hues. So, and cadmium would be your yellows, oranges, and reds often. So look for the hue. Okay, one funny thing to know about cold porcelain too, you can mix oil and acrylic together in cold porcelain, which is kind of unheard of. You definitely can't do that with painting. Like if you try to put it on a canvas and use both acrylic and oils, they will not mix. But for whatever reason in cold porcelain, I don't know if it's the glue adhesives, binders, or what, but it will actually work. You can use, like, let's say if I wanted to use a red acrylic paint and a yellow oil paint, I can do that in cold porcelain. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is using color concentrates. You can purchase color concentrates of cold porcelain, and I'll get a sample out here. Oh. Okay, so here we have, this is soft type clay, soft air dry clay. This is green concentrate, and I've got a million different ones of hardy clay in here. There's reds. Usually the common ones are like bright red and green, because those are often hard colors to mix using acrylic and oils. If you use acrylic and oil, if you use acrylics and oils, you'll usually just get a pastel shade. You won't get the nice deep colors that you're looking for unless you use a concentrate. There are tricks to using acrylic and oil to get the dark color, but most often people will just buy the concentrates, which can get pricey. So I'm going to explain some tricks here in a bit on how to avoid that. So you can buy color concentrates from various people. Modena has color concentrates, Hardy has color concentrates, Deco has color concentrates. And basically you tear off a small bit of the clay and just mix it with a larger mass of white clay. And depending on how much of the concentrate you put into the white, the darker it'll be. I seldom use the color concentrates. I just think that they're expensive, and I've learned over time how to avoid using them by using the acrylics and the oils and doing layers of color. So next I want to talk about this funny little thing here. I discovered this a couple years ago, and I don't know what the proper name for it is. This one, it says Padico color scale. I just call it a Dimple chart. And basically you can see, you can fill up each little dimple with the color concentrates so that you can get calculated measurements of the color concentrate. So you can create recipes. So for instance, the dimple chart usually comes with the little color mixing chart. This is handy. Like I said, if you're using the color concentrates, it'll tell you, yellow plus, it'll give you the size, like A plus this equals that, and helps you to get consistent results. You could also use this with paint, the dimple chart with paint. Like you could fill the dimple chart with this much paint and then maybe this much clay, and write that down to get a recipe for your colors. So that's one idea. Usually this is used with like the soft clays like Hardy Soft or the Deco clays. Okay, some things you need to know when you are mixing paint with cold porcelain. You add a drop at a time, and I mean a small drop. If you add too much at once, your clay will get really, really sticky. So you just want to add a drop at a time. And also keep in mind that when the clay dries, it's going to be darker than when you started. If you're mixing paint in and you get to this point where it's like, oh, this is really sticky, you probably need to stop. Okay, you're not going to be able to add more paint to it. It's just the clay is going to start to disintegrate. The quality of the dried clay will be not good. And at that point, when it's getting sticky, put a little bit of Nivea cream or hand cream on your hands, just a skim coating, and then start to work the clay again, and that will help to cut the stickiness out of your clay. But I would not add any more paint past that point. Okay, so a few things I did not talk about and why. Liquid food coloring. To me, liquid food coloring is fine. I don't personally use it. I don't see any advantage over using it over oils or acrylics. If you have the liquid and you don't have the other materials like the acrylic and the oils, then by all means you should use it. And do your color tests. Inks. I have used inks in the past. I found it to be really messy. I don't recommend it for that reason. You're going to have ink all over your hands. I've even colored the dry clay after it's dry. So anyway, but I just don't like working with inks. Maybe that's what you have, and like I said, use what you have and do tests. Now, gouache. I do see some artists using gouache. To me, gouache has like almost a clay-like or dry consistency. And I like that whatever binders they use in the acrylic and the oils, that it doesn't have that dry matte finish. I feel like if I used gouache that my clay would dry and be hard and brittle. Now I could be wrong on that. And like I said, if you have it and you don't have the other stuff, then you should use it. But I just prefer to use the acrylics and the oils. I just think if I used gouache, the quality of the clay would not be as good. Now I would consider using it possibly after the clay was dry on like doing freckles, maybe on the lilies or something, but I think it would also leave brush strokes just the same. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is powdered food coloring. This is something that I never see talked about in any cold porcelain videos. Not liquid, but powdered. It's so much more concentrated than the liquid. I use this not after I've made the clay, but when I am making my homemade clay. This is when you use it. You actually would take out, like this is maybe a couple teaspoons worth. This is Lorian brand, LorianOils.com, powdered food coloring. And so this is like two teaspoons maybe. So what I do is when I'm mixing up my homemade clay, there's always the cornstarch or some kind of starch in your recipe. You take out 2 teaspoons, or approximately how much you're going to put in, of your starch. You take out that much, and then you replace that starch with the color concentrate. Now, if you're making a double batch, you may need to add more. But for me, usually my 1 cup cornstarch with my 1 cup glue recipes, like that ratio, usually takes about 1 container of this. So you mix that in before you cook it. And you can mix it, I would mix it right in with the cornstarch first, get it thoroughly mixed, and then add your glue. But it will give you a color concentrate like the type you would buy. So that's how I usually avoid buying a color concentrate, is I buy my powdered food coloring. There's other brands, I haven't tried them, the Lorian. The only time I've actually used the powdered food coloring was to get a very nice green for leaves and things. So colored food coloring, that's the secret. I find it kind of to be a lot of work though, because I don't usually use an entire batch of green clay at once. So what I usually do for my green leaves is I use the Winton or Winsor Newton sap green. I mix that in with my little bit of clay that I'm working with, and I'll make my leaf. Now after my leaf is dry, I go back over it with a light coating of more sap green oil paint. So that's how I most often do my leaves anymore, is just using the sap green oil paint, just mixed in, and then after it's dry, I coat it on top. So those are my secrets, people.